Hello and welcome to this presentation on Raymond Williams and his essay, Culture is Ordinary. Raymond Williams is a 20th century British critic who played a major role in the introduction of cultural studies as a significant branch of literary studies. The prescribed essay, Culture is Ordinary, is one of his well known essays, and it is one which has often been considered as a kind of starting point of cultural studies. Because in this essay, and particularly in its title, the three words, Culture is Ordinary, he encapsulates the very premise of cultural studies, the fact that culture is ordinary and that it is not what it had till then been made out to be, particularly in elitist and specialist notions of culture. Williams has indeed written quite a bit about culture, and one could make a special reference to his entry on this word in his major work, Keywords, where he tries to explicate the meanings of different words used in political and cultural and literary studies. Now, the entry on culture there runs into some six pages, and at the very outset, he says that culture is one of the two or three most complicated words in the English language. He undertakes a historical study of the word, looks at its etymology, looks at its usage in the past and in contemporary times, and then also refers to its various the other words related to culture, the word culture as used in other languages, and concludes on this note that culture is indeed a very complex word. But he states that the complexity is not in the word itself, but in the problems which its variations of use significantly indicate. And we will get precisely that idea regarding culture and its various explanations or and the ways, different ways in which it is comprehended in this essay. So, what Williams achieves in this essay is a democratizing of the very concept of culture. He presents culture as something that is constantly evolving, changing, and shifting, something that's dynamic and is a fragmented field of power relations. In other words, he rejects the notion of culture as something that is constant, something that is organic and whole, and something that is fixed. Not at all. It's something that keeps changing. And he also points out how culture is generally understood in two different ways. Sometimes it is used to refer to a general way of life. That is the common meaning that we attach to culture when we talk about a way of life. The culture of the British people, the culture of the Asians, for example, when you refer to a whole way of life, that sense of culture. On the other hand, you have the very special understanding of culture when culture is used to refer to, certain creative activities, performance, and so on. Culture, fine arts, and culture, painting and arts and dance and music and that kind of specialist meaning of culture. And he points out how it is wrong to separate these two meanings. In other words, they are so linked. One is connected to the other. And he insists, therefore, on the conjunction of these two senses of culture, the general and the specialist. Raymond Williams was born in Wales, which is often considered as the border country of England. Well, from Wales, he moved to England and reached the University of Cambridge, which was where he completed his higher education and where he came in contact with some of the eminent academicians of those times. He was much influenced by leftist and Marxist thinking, and his writings on politics, on culture, on mass media, and literature are a significant contribution to Marxist readings of culture and the arts. He was a major, played a major role in laying the foundation for the field of cultural studies and particularly the cultural materialist approach. Mention can be made of his major works like Culture and Society, The Long Revolution, Keywords, and Marxism and Literature. He was also a novelist, and in during the later years of his life, he was very influential in fields other than those of literary studies. He played a significant role in the environmental movement and in various other fields of activity. The name of Raymond Williams is inextricably linked with cultural materialism, a theoretical approach which sees culture as a productive process, culture as part of the means of production. It is a kind of committed and political analysis of the connection between the literary text and the background of the power relations in which the text has its origin. Of course, he was greatly indebted to Marxist literary theory in zeroing in towards cultural materialism. However, he rejected the simplistic explanation of culture as merely a product of material conditions as it is traditionally interpreted in Marxism. Traditional Marxist thinking can be considered as deterministic in its attitude towards culture, because it sees culture as something that is determined, something that results because of the economic forces. Culture, like every other activity in the superstructure, in the base superstructure model, is seen as nothing but a reflection of the economic forces. But even as he, moved beyond that statement made by Marxist critics, he also kept away from the traditional idealist aesthetics, which gives importance mainly to the value embedded in a work of art, looks at the ideals that it promotes, looks at the aesthetic value of the literary work, and hardly gives any consideration to the material root of that cultural product or that literary text. So, what Raymond Williams does is traversing a path between these two extremes. And in doing so, he was much influenced by the Italian Marxist thinker Antonio Gramsci, who had spoken about the folklore of philosophy. It was a phrase that he coined to explain the way in which a prevailing worldview saturates a society to such an extent that it becomes such a natural part of it. You cannot think beyond it. It becomes part of your vision, very closely related to the ideological state apparatuses that Louis Althusser, the French thinker, spoke about. Now, Raymond Williams called this very impalpable, almost unnoticeable form of social consciousness as structures of feeling. It is a kind of coming together of thought as felt and feeling as thought. It's a kind of practical consciousness which shapes the way we think and act. So, here are some more points on cultural materialism, which basically explores the historical context and the political implications of a text, and embarks on a close textual analysis in order to study the dominant hegemonic position and the possibilities for the rejection or the subversion of that position. It has very many parallels with the American school of new historicism too. In any case, however, cultural materialism is an approach that really played a predominant role in shaping literary studies during the middle of the 20th century, especially so in Britain. In the slide, you will see a depiction of the traditional Marxist view, the basic tenets of the base and superstructure, where the socio-economic base upholds the ideology of the dominant class, the ones who own the means of production, and which therefore shapes the superstructure of the activities that include the politics, the religion, the philosophy, the art, the culture, the family, the education, the law, the media, every activity, every such superstructure activity of that society. Williams's view of culture was not as one-sided or monolithic as that traditional Marxist interpretation. He took into account the different structures of feeling. He was one of the first to point out the contradictory nature of social ideologies, rather than just one kind of ideology being upheld, one kind of, the dominant ideology he was aware of, and he pointed out the existence of these contradictory social ideologies simultaneously. And therefore, it is the whole picture emerges not as a one-sided monolithic image, but you can see the contradictions even within the dominant ideologies. And in so doing, in pointing out the various contradictions, it also, his approach also pointed out the existence of the marginalized, the residual, and the new and emerging and alternative ideologies in the same culture. So rather than one major tree trunk of ideology upholding the superstructure, you have the existence of many, branches or many trees, many tree trunks existing, coexisting. And these contradictory ideologies, as he very positively pointed out, hold great promise, because once you realize that there are contradictory ideologies, we are moving away from the deterministic model of culture. We are not allowing, a priority to just any one model of ideology to have a deterministic role on culture and other activities in the society. It alone cannot have a monopoly over the cultural activities. So, alongside this, Raymond Williams also pointed out the way in which the cultural forms or the superstructure activities themselves can contribute in return to the social, economic, and the political development of the society. And what is, again, as I pointed out, quite promising in the whole picture here is the fact that because ideologies are contradictory, as he pointed out, you have a lot of space for dissidence, for disagreement, for pointing out the hegemony of the hegemonic nature of any one ideology. And literature, as in this scheme, is seen as something that breaks up, exposes, and displaces ideology. It does not give priority or prominence to any one ideology, and therefore it can mediate powerful structures of feeling. In other words, it's a powerful source of emancipatory and cultural possibilities. So, it has a very inclusive outlook. It emerges as a site where you have many ideologies existing side by side, including marginalized, peripheral, emergent, and residual and alternative ones. So it was in this kind of situation that cultural studies has its origin. Cultural studies, a kind of interdisciplinary area of study that is concerned with the social institutions and the role that they play in shaping culture. It is something that emerged in Britain in the late 1950s and then, of course, spread internationally. We identify the birth of cultural studies as as an academic discipline with the foundation of the CCCS, the Triple CS, the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies at the University of Birmingham in the year 1964, with such scholars as Richard Hoggart, Stuart Hall, and of course Raymond Williams too. Williams's works played a very significant role the in the philosophy that upheld the Triple CS. And among the central concerns of cultural studies would be the role played by race, class, ethnicity, gender, and so on in the production of cultural knowledge. Let us now come to the essay Culture is Ordinary, written around the year 1958, a work or an essay that can be considered as one of the founding texts of cultural studies. We need to understand the context in which it was written. He wrote it as a kind of response to some of the prevalent notions regarding culture, particularly the elitist ones expressed in the works of some of the major influential thinkers, writers, and critics of those times. We need to especially think of the major influence wielded by people like Matthew Arnold in a work like Culture and Anarchy, T.S. Eliot in works like Notes Towards a Definition of Culture, and the academic F.R. Lewis in works like The Great Tradition. So, in the works of these writers and thinkers, and of course in those of many others too, we encounter a kind of division in society. They envision that division, and you see society made up of two categories of people, two or sometimes more categories. In any case, there is always a class or a category that has a particular kind of culture which is considered as good and noble, and the other class or category as being deprived of or not having that kind of a culture, who are considered to be rather crude and not very cultured. So, this binary was something that troubled a person like Raymond Williams when he, during his probably days in England as a student who had come in from rural Wales. Take the example of Matthew Arnold's work, Culture and Anarchy, for example, written in 1869. It went on to play a very dominant role in shaping ideas regarding art, literature, and culture in general. He was very much concerned about what he called the study of perfection, and he conveyed the idea that with a new kind of democracy that was ushered into England post industrial revolution and so on, there was a kind of anarchy that prevailed in the land. It lacked certain fine standards, what he would call the touchstone. So it lacked standards, and it lacked a sense of direction. So there was much he felt that the society should learn and unlearn in order to become more refined and more cultured in general. F.R. Lewis, similarly, was one of the most influential of academicians of those times. He, you even have a kind of approach which is known as Lewisism in the field of literary studies. He was, of course, greatly influenced by Matthew Arnold, and he shared Arnold's notion that culture is the very high point in any civilization, and that it is the concern of an educated minority. He argued that there was a kind of culture that prevailed in England during the pre-industrial revolution, during the days of the pre-independent industrial revolution, and that there was something authentic about it. It was, in fact, the golden age. and a lot of crudeness had seeped into culture and society with the industrialization and with the kind of opening up of institutions, educational and other institutions, to the ordinary people, according to his vision. And then there was T.S. Eliot, who shared or who saw culture as something that is very, very organic and which can only be transmitted through conventional establishments like the family. He just could not see any separation of religion and culture. He more or less conveyed the idea that culture depended on a kind of persistence of social classes. It is in that kind of structured society that you can hope for the best transmission of what he saw as a culture. So, as a person who declared himself to be a royalist, an Anglican, and a classicist, naturally, Eliot upheld a notion of culture which was elitist in its outlook, and he just could not imagine the existence of a classless society. So, it is in this context that the essay Culture is Ordinary has a very significant position. Written by Raymond Williams, who is best remembered today as a thinker who challenged the literary notions, theories prevalent during those times. He challenged both the elite literary theories and the simplistic and deterministic forms of Marxism, which dominated English universities in the 1940s and 1950s. Raymond Williams hailed from Wales, which, as I have already told you, is often considered as a marginalized a region compared to the more cosmopolitan England, and it is considered as the border country. Um, but he takes us back to those very Welsh roots in this essay to convey to us how he could, take a stand of defiance against the interpretations of culture that were prevalent during the time, around the time that he wrote this essay, which would be the late 1950s. I have also added there a link to a video, a YouTube video, which would help you to understand better the difference between the elitist notions of culture and those of Raymond Williams. In other words, the school of Raymond Williams versus the school of F.R. Lewis. Raymond Williams's cultural materialism and versus F.R. Lewis's Lewisism. The essay begins with a description of the journey from rural Wales to the urban University of Cambridge, a journey that Raymond Williams undertook and which made him what he was when he wrote this essay. Now, at the outset, Williams makes a distinction between the two prevailing definitions of culture. Now, there are those who consider culture to be a word that relates to a general way of life, and the others who consider culture as specifically referring to creativity in the arts, learning, and so on. But Williams is absolutely certain about the fact that these two senses should not be separated. In fact, it is in their conjunction, it is in their coming together that the real meaning of culture lies. Then he talks about the two practices that he observed as a student in the University of Cambridge, the two prevailing senses of culture, both of which he says he dislikes. The first of which is the tea shop culture, a kind of culture that was practiced by some people as a kind of visible sign of a particular kind of refinement or upbringing and cultivation, frequenting these tea shops and then indulging in the kind of activities which were considered as the signs of being cultured. And on the other hand, you have what he calls the drinking hole culture of the culture vultures, the people who do not bother about the ethical content of culture and merely dabble in the technical things, who keep talking about their skill or their awareness of linguistics and psychology and sociology, and try to influence the mind of the people with their knowledge. So he has absolutely no regard for these two senses in which culture was being practiced, the tea shop culture and the drinking hole culture. The essay Culture is Ordinary begins with a description of a bus journey. Now, Williams had undertaken this kind of journey from rural Wales to urban England. And this journey, with all its people, backgrounds, places, events, incidents, had made him what he is. And he has now come to a position where he makes a categorical statement about his understanding of culture. He observes the fact that there are generally two ways in which people talk about culture. On the one hand, you have the definition of culture as something to do with a general way of life. And on the other, you have the understanding of culture that is related to creativity in the arts and learning, a specialized kind of understanding of culture. Now, Raymond Williams disagrees with the separation of these two senses and believes that it is in their conjunction, it is in the coming together of these two senses of culture that you can get a real understanding of culture. And by reminding the readers at every turn in this essay that culture is ordinary, that there is nothing really elitist or there's nothing really special or unique about it, he comes down to referring to the two prevailing practices of culture, as he saw in his contemporaries. There was one sense in which there was a kind of tea shop culture to begin with, a kind of visible a sign of a special kind of cultivated people. He is, of course, referring to the people who did fashionable things like going to the tea shop and engaging in activities which made them appear to be cultured and refined and belonging to a certain class. That is tea shop culture, a very visible manifestation of culture. And on the other hand, you have what he calls the drinking hole culture of the culture vultures, the people who are not really bothered about the ethical content of culture and are merely interested in dabbling in technical things. He calls these people the cheap jacks who show off their knowledge of subjects like linguistics and psychology and sociology and appear to be, the new elite, the newly educated people who have the power to influence the mass mind. So Raymond Williams is categorical about the fact that he has no patience, he has absolutely no disagreement with either the very flashy tea shop culture or the very showy drinking hole culture of the culture vultures. In the next part of the essay, he talks about the two major influences that shaped him and his outlook on life and culture in general. And these two influences are Marxism and Lewisism, or the influence of Marx and F.R. Lewis. Now, he first talks about what he has learned from the Marxists and the three different lines along which he cannot see eye to eye with the Marxists. He agrees fully with the Marxist idea that culture has its origin in the socio-economic background. But he does not fully agree with the fact that culture must be interpreted only in the light of its underlying system of production. He's absolutely certain about the fact that culture is vibrant and dynamic enough to have an impact on the system of production itself. He quotes examples of the ways in which the cultural products have had an effect, a radical shift, effect and influence on the society, the socio-political structure of a society. So that is the first point regarding Marxism, which he disagrees with. The second point is about the masses. In Marxist thinking, there is generally a very concrete or watertight distinction that is made between the bourgeois and the proletariat, the owners and the workers in the economy. And there is a general tendency, says Williams, to consider the masses as the ignorant lot, the ones who are kept away from education, who are deprived of any attempt at refining and bettering themselves. And this is a kind of understanding that Marxism, traditional Marxism, works upon the fact that the large majority of the people are kept away from education and that they are a deprived and ignorant lot. Now, with his years of experience, having worked with the Marxist Party and with the various experiences that he has had, Williams disagrees with that and says very clearly that it is not as if there is a section which constantly remains ignorant, or that the working class is always to be considered as the ignorant, uneducated lot. That situation has changed, says Williams. And the third point that he has associated with Marxism and with which he has serious differences would be that of their idea regarding what the nature of a good literary work should be. The Marxists generally believe, the socialists generally believe that for socialists to succeed, we need literature that is, of a particular nature. It has to prescribe ways for people to write, along, think, learn, and so on. So it's a kind of prescription that the socialist establishment gives a lot of importance to, in the belief that it is only by reading these kind of these models of literature and other works of art that a people can become enlightened, that a society can succeed in creating a socialist and egalitarian society. In other words, the tendency to prescribe good literature, prescribe literature and culture that has a definite shade, that has a definite color, which supports socialist thinking. He disagrees with that kind of prescriptive mode and believes that the best society is one where the writers and artists are left free and where they have the freedom to express themselves in as creative and as liberated a manner as possible. So these are the three Marxist ideas that Williams categorically states he has differences of opinions with. And then he talks about Lewis and the influence that F.R. Lewis had on the field of culture in general and on his own views in particular. He's absolutely sure about the fact that Lewis is definitely a better guide than the Marxists when it comes to the real relations between art and experience. However, the major disagreement that Raymond Williams has with F.R. Lewis is with his tendency to romanticize the old, with his tendency to create a very strong divide between the pre and post industrial revolution culture in such a way that you always see the old as contrasted to the new, the old as being valuable, the old as being pure, and the new as being cheap and vulgar. Now, Raymond Williams, belongs to a kind of background, an agrarian background, which has really witnessed and benefited from the Industrial Revolution. And he does not have too many bad things to say about the Industrial Revolution. In fact, he says he belongs to a group of people who are grateful for the changes ushered in by the Industrial Revolution and the ways in which the industries have lightened their labor and made life much easier for them. So he just cannot imagine anybody, who once they have experienced the benefits of electrification or even a tablet like aspirin would ever want to go back to the old ways where they deal with pain in a rather crude manner, or do with unmechanized, unelectrified ways of production. So Raymond Williams states that this myth that F.R. Lewis propagates regarding those simpler and golden times is, it's this idea that F.R. Lewis propagates regarding those earlier, simpler times is nothing but a myth. Nobody would want to go back to those days, having experienced the benefits of technology. So Raymond Williams is of the opinion that these new technological advances can never be bad for the society. All the same, he is aware of the new, modes of popular culture which had gained a lot of popularity around those times, and he is aware of the kind of vulgarity that was being propagated by the strip newspapers and the people whom he calls the cheap jacks. So how do you account for the kind of changes that have been brought in by these new modes of popular culture, and which can not be accepted as the refined elite models of culture, the good models of culture, when you analyze these along the traditional lines? He says it's just a matter of your vision, and we are so impatient with these new forms of vulgar popular culture because of the heavy load or the heavy baggage that has been left behind by the cultural critics. They have kind of left a legacy with us, and they have made us, blind to these new notions of culture. So what we need to do, says Raymond Williams, is to debunk that legacy, to subvert the kind of baggage that has been left behind by the cultural critics. And he sums up the legacy of those cultural critics, the baggage that they have left behind, in, he says, to quote Raymond Williams, 2 false equations, 1 false analogy, and 1 false proposition. So he takes up these 4 points for discussion in the next part of the essay. He begins with the false proposition, and that is the fact that, this is what the cultural critics, this is the idea that the cultural critics disseminated, the fact that ugliness is the price that we pay for new sources of power, production, transportation, and communication. That the new forms of industrialization and the new ways of life have really made our land ugly, physically and metaphorically, literally and metaphorically. And the argument that Williams raises with very powerful examples in the essay is that these new sources of power may appear to be ugly at first, but eventually they will only lead to a greater deal of cleanliness. England will become clean and pleasant again. So it is only because of that initial hesitation to accept these that we would probably see them as ugly. And even if there is a little bit of change, considering the fact that real change is being ushered in, we need to be prepared for change. The change may appear ugly initially, But in the long run, these changes will only lead to greater cleanliness. It goes without saying that, with each new development, we have really been looking at ways that reduce pollution. So, what Williams does here is to challenge the tendency to consider the working classes and their life and their culture as crude, unrefined, and not worthy of being described as good or noble. Now, Williams comes to the two equations, the two false equations. The first of these, he says, is that popular education is responsible for the new commercial culture of the masses. The fact that, or the understanding, or the belief that the opening up of the doorways of education to the ordinary people, to the people of the working classes, was in many ways responsible for the defilement of culture, for culture becoming ordinary. Now, Williams puts up a very strong argument against this kind of equation. He argues on two levels. First of all, he says the very concept of masses is a wrong one. And it is wrong to distinguish between the masses and the classes. He says the problem actually lies in the attitudes towards masses. It is in the mind, or it is in our attitudes, that people become, or people are treated as masses. He says what is considered as a mass or a group of people is no different from anyone else in society. So it is this branding and this kind of attitude that has to be changed. And it is of utmost importance that we understand that the masses are not the mob. In other words, it is not as if all the people who belong to the so-called working classes have but one feature, the feature of being unrefined and not civilized enough. You're treating them like a mob, and this, he says, is a very wrong assessment to be made. So the masses should not be considered as the mob, and it is only in our attitudes and in our minds that people, the ordinary people, can be considered as the masses. So he refutes that equation at one level, saying that popular education is responsible for the lowering of the standards of culture. Now, secondly, he says, the second point that he raises against this first equation is that there is an assumption that popular education and commercial culture are in a cause and effect relationship. This was particularly popularized by the findings of a commission called the Northcliffe's Commission. And this commission had come out with a statement that the Education Act of 1870, one that made education more accessible to more and more numbers of people. This Educational Act of 1870 was directly connected to, or was directly responsible for, the new, cheap, and popular vulgar press. And Williams, denies this kind of cause and effect relationship between the Education Act of 1870 and the popularization of the new print, or the new kind of trends seen in the press of those times. He argues that whatever was being seen was nothing but a result of the major change that was being ushered in by the new industrialism, with more and more opportunities for people to set up printing presses and publish their own materials. And it is in no way connected to the education of the larger number of people. In fact, he points out that actually, even before the Education Act came into being, there were enough and more literate people. And it was not as if this Educational Act, which made it possible for more numbers to be educated, was in any way responsible for this popularization and vulgarization of culture. So he deny or he uh, dispels or he uh, rejects the first equation. And the second equation, he says, is that there is a belief that popular culture accurately reflects the mind, feeling, and quality of living of its consumers. That what is crude and unrefined in culture is nothing but a reflection of the life of the people who produce it and also those who consume it. And it is with regard to this point that he has very strong disagreement. And he quotes from his own experiences, the kind of interactions that he's had with people who belong to the working classes, including his own father. And he says that, there was nothing that amounted to any lack of intelligence or good sense or refinement in any one of those people. They had as much sense, as much intelligence, and as much taste as anyone else in society. So it is wrong, he says, to equate popular culture with the quality of life of its consumers. And finally, Williams comes to the false analogy put up by the cultural critics. They believe that just as Grisham's law convinces us that bad money will drive out the good, so also bad culture will drive out the good. Williams thinks that it is a very false kind of analogy, and he believes that increase in bad culture does not in any way mean a decrease in good culture, because we need to understand that culture can never be considered as something that is fixed and static and which has a permanent value attached to it. Culture is dynamic, culture keeps changing, culture keeps evolving and expanding. And therefore, one can never treat it in the way one would treat material entities like money or wealth. So, having raised these 4 points, as a very strong argument against the stand taken by the cultural critics, William says that there's more work for him to do. He's planning to take up a writing along these lines in a more serious manner, and he believes that he has only reached the starting point. He is convinced that the ideas of our Lewis and the Marxists need to be developed further and also, very importantly, to be radically revised. And he says that this is the right time to start asking real questions about the social and economic problems raised by the relative rate of expansion of culture. So, as he proposes to embark on this journey of pursuing cultural studies with greater rigor, with um, the desire to see greater change in people's attitudes towards culture, he hopes to see three major changes in the society. The first of these has to deal with education. He hopes that very soon there would come a time when people would recognize the ordinariness of education. In other words, he hopes that people would recognize that education is not the privilege or the prerogative of only a select few, or that it caters only to special kinds of skills. In other words, the education has to be radically um, overhauled. To do that, the syllabus prescribed in the centers of learning will have to be redesigned to a point of full human relevance and control. What is needed, says Raymond Williams, is a full liberal education for all, one that gives adequate recognition and respect to every activity, and one that does not discriminate between what is called the high and the low in terms of work and culture. So, a full liberal education for all, that is of utmost importance. Secondly, he hopes to see greater funding for the arts and also for adult learning, and particularly so in the different regions. In other words, culture or high culture and arts and so on should never be the monopoly of just the capital city, like the city of London, but there should be a kind of regional equity, and there should be many more centers in different regions of the country where the arts would be promoted and where there would be recognition given to the different artisans, tradesmen, the craftspeople who pursue different vocations in different parts of the country. And a ready made model of culture is something that should be totally rejected. One that, a ready made model that is predetermined and one that is handed over to the others as a model to be emulated. And that is to be rejected, and people should be able to uh, look up to their own model of culture as fully acceptable. And finally, he looks forward, or he envisages the freedom of the mass media, the press and the television in particular. These channels of mass media, he hopes, will soon be free enough, where they are not controlled by the financing of the advertisers, nor the power and the pressure exerted by the politicians. So, that kind of freedom for the mass media is definitely something that will augur well for the field of culture, in making culture to be accepted as ordinary, as something that belongs to everyone. So, having highlighted these three wishes of his, Raymond Williams concludes on a note of reiteration that culture is indeed ordinary, and that it is um, ever on the expanding mode. It is never fixed, it is never static, it is never predetermined. Culture keeps changing, it is expanding, it is dynamic, and it should always be a site of inclusion and never one of exclusion.